Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian in Bremerton, Washington, where we are going to interview the commander of Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, Captain Howard Markle. Sir, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a real honor. The first thing I wanted to ask is, you obviously run one of the Navy's most important nuclear shipyards. You've got nearly 14,000 folks in your workforce. This is your 125th anniversary. That's where I want to start first. What makes you proud about this facility and its history?
Yeah, well, if you look back over the course of the 125 years, you'll clearly see that one of the things we pride ourselves on is working towards what the Navy and the nation need us to do. All the way back through when we were initially founded, working on the initial commissioning of some of the original ships, all the way through Pearl Harbor when we worked to bring the 5 battleships back into play before the war ended that were damaged there, to today when we work on not only here in Bremerton, but our detachments in San Diego, the detachment over in Yokosuka, and making sure that we keep the force ready to do what it's tasked to go do.
You mentioned Pearl Harbor. It's the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Those ships did end up coming there. What happened to those ships, and what was the role of the shipyard in World War II? You know, how big did it grow, and what are some of the things that it accomplished during the war?
Yeah, so not only did we repair the 5 battleships that were obviously key in the war effort that were returned before the end of the war, but we also built or repaired over 500 ships here during the war period, with the shipyard ultimately growing to almost 33,000 folks throughout the war. Fortunately, as we were walking up towards that event in the early 1930s, we were ramping up. The machine shop was built in the early 1930s. That obviously helped us get there. We were ramping up in our dry docks up towards the 4th at that period, ultimately leading through Dry Dock 5 and Dry Dock 6 that we have today, Dry Dock 6 being the only aircraft carrier, Nimitz-class aircraft carrier capable dry dock on the West Coast. Very strategic in our mission that we were a focal part of the war effort and bringing everybody back in the 1940s, and we're obviously a focal part of the effort today, keeping the Navy fit to do what it does in the Pacific Theater.
When you mentioned Pacific Theater, you guys have detachments all over. What are some of the big challenges you guys face in supporting ships over such a vast geographic area?
Yeah, well, it's like anything, as we look to both balancing here with the balance of the workload in the workforce, that same challenge occurs as we look to support the ships that we support in San Diego, Yokosuka, Japan, and ultimately up the river in Bremerton, as well as Everett. So, when we on average have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 folks on travel each and every day from the shipyard. Those folks support across those places that we discussed. Right now, we've got the USS Theodore Roosevelt in availability in San Diego. I just flew back from Japan yesterday. We're about ready to start our annual availability on the USS Ronald Reagan in Japan. So balancing out the travel amongst the folks, because our folks, as I said, do a large amount of travel, so balancing out their quality of life as they travel around, supporting all those ships, as well as making sure we have the flex to support the 4 deployed ships. We do work in Guam on some of the 4 deployed ships, making sure we've got the assets available to support both the ongoing work here, as well as making sure we can support those that are deployed and deploying is a tough challenge, but the folks do a great job managing that effort.
We in Washington talk a lot about the Budget Control Act, and you're at the pointy end of the spear. What has the Budget Control Act and the budget caps meant for you and your shipyard? Even though you're doing priority work, it's also had an impact. What's the kind of impact it's had on Puget Sound Naval Shipyard?
As we step through, the biggest impact we had from the sequestration, the Budget Control Acts, the financial challenges that we've seen, each year we end up, depending on how things go with a continuing resolution, whatever happens with the Act, we end up cash flowing our efforts throughout the year to make sure that we can continue to support. That's everything from onboarding personnel. As we looked at sequestration and the hiring freezes that occurred, that obviously had an impact that ultimately created some bow wave of work. Obviously, if I don't have the people, I can't execute the work. So what you end up doing is you have to then reschedule the entire out-year workload in order to balance that effort again. The key being in any one of our years of successful execution is balancing the workload that we're tasked with the workforce I have available. So if one comes out of balance, the other one obviously has to give. In that there's not an endless supply of whatever might come in, either from private sector partners, HII, Newport News, EB, some other private sector entity that comes in and helps us with workload, or increasing the overtime that obviously has a limit as well. So there's only a finite amount that I can execute any given year. So when we start out with a deficit, that deficit's got to go somewhere, and it normally leads to rolling outside the fiscal year. So.
There is talk, obviously, President-elect Trump has made clear, and Republican leaders who control the House and Senate have made clear that they want to scrap the Budget Control Act. It looks like there is going to be more money for defense. If there's more money, what's on your wish list? What are some of the priorities that you've deferred that you'd like to be able to put some money against if there is more money?
It'd probably be primarily on people and facilities. The facilities over the years, when one of the first things that gets cut on any given year is the military construction budget, some of the facility recapitalization. We, as many of the facilities, have been victims of those cuts, and we really need to start thinking about what we need to do to recapitalize those. So I'd probably start with the investment backlog that we have in recapitalizing the older facilities, some of our support infrastructure. I mean, as we discussed, the shipyard was built in the early 1900s through predominantly the 1940s, and those electrical systems, power systems, air, all the things that exist just like in any town that exists in America, those things have to be recapitalized. I'd probably focus on that, as well as we'd look to getting back to that balance question again, I'd look to probably hiring some additional people if in fact that was one of the things the Navy determined was the right way to balance our workforce. I'd end up hiring some people to in fact buy down that workload backlog that we have right now.
Speaking about backlog, I mean, that was a challenge. Chief of Naval Operations has talked about it. Other senior leaders in the Navy have talked about the nuclear repair backlog and part of skills shortages. Talk to us about the backlog, how you're eating through the backlog, and how's it going hiring and training up what is really among the most experienced and most technically sophisticated industrial workers we have in the country.
Right. So that gets back to, fortunately, the Navy recognized that we were at a deficit. They authorized us to hire up. Since 2013, our workforce has increased by 2,600 people. That's the good news part of the story. The tougher part of that challenge is, in fact, training that. 38% of the workforce right now has less than 5 years of experience in the shipyard, so a difficult challenge. Historically, what we'd do is we'd pull those people through a 4-year apprentice program to get them trained up to do what we need them to do inside the shipyard. We don't have that luxury. I need them on the waterfront much faster. So we've morphed the training systems over time. In fact, to walk through a incremental qualification program to get them trained and qualified in the individual piece parts of what I need them to do, get them out to the waterfront, and then bring them back into training again to incrementally build them up. But get them utilized in an effective and efficient manner out in the waterfront quicker than what we had seen previously. That was really our focus in the development of the folks. Our continuous training and development program, building the mock-ups, the learning centers. As you look at what we've had to change over time in the training program, it's really about bringing the training program rapidly to the workforce, what they need in order to execute, and getting them out to the waterfront. So much so that as we develop the training centers, the learning centers, it's not just about the individual trades anymore. It's about building the teams and developing the teams as they go out, because it's not just an issue with the production mechanics. It's an issue with engineering, the technicians, all the people who support the effort need to be developed over time together in order to go out and produce the efforts that we need on the waterfront. So as you look at the training programs and what we're doing, that high velocity learning thought, that thought of how it is that you bring learning as fast as you can in the areas that you need out to do what we need to do, it's those things that we're focusing our efforts on, as well as we go out and work with those folks as they develop, bringing very quickly back the issues of the waterfront today into the learning environment and changing the training such that it meets the needs of the folks that we have available to us in order to execute the workload.
You've been in the Navy more than 30 years. You were prior enlisted before you became an officer. You've served on surface ships. You've served on destroyers, submarines, ballistic missile subs, as well as aircraft carriers, where you were the chief engineer. How has learning changed in that time? And when the Chief of Naval Operations talks about high velocity learning, as you mentioned, Admiral Richardson, that's high velocity learning. and being more flexible and more creative, soliciting and getting ideas from the deck plates is something that's important to them. How has the mentality in the force changed in the time that you've been in service, and how do you think it has to change as you go in the future, as education levels, access to information, everything in society about how we learn and do things fundamentally changes?
Yeah, it's I guess the biggest focus is it's less focused on the rigid structured classroom training and more about the how do we take the hands-on on the deck plate training to get folks what they need. And it's back to that incremental thing again. In the old days, we'd take people and we'd drag them through a very extensive, long, focused period of training to get them everything they could possibly need in order to go out. If you look at the thoughts that are occurring today, it's all about what do we need in order at that person at that time in their career, and then how do we develop that over time as they move through their career, and what might they be able to do in different areas of interest to them, as well as what we need in the Navy to be a little more flexible and a lot less rigid in how it is that we develop and maintain our folks. And I think that's what a lot of what even we talk about generational differences, but it's really what we're all looking for. It's how do I continue to do what interests me and weave that into what does the Navy need us to do as we develop that.
As you look for ideas, though, military services sometimes are very good about taking ideas from the bottom, but sometimes less good at doing that. And what's the trick to empower junior folks to give their seniors great ideas? But how do you vet, how does this whole system have to work so that, sort of the harebrained schemes, because you want to give everybody their due, but ultimately it's, not all ideas are equal in their impact and their importance. What's the right mechanisms that you need, for example, even at your command level and you're doing, to solicit those good ideas, vet them appropriately, and act on the right ones, so that you can get this virtuous loop going?
Yeah, it's as much about encouraging the ideas to come forward as it is putting the things in place to take those ideas and run with them. Some things may be as easy as just having the facilities available. Like we have what we call a moonshine lab. The sole purpose of that effort is just to take the ideas from the waterfront, provide people, parts, and material towards putting those things into practice. It could be something as easy as modifying a tool that would take less than a shift to go do, but I need to have the people and the parts, the engineers to go through the design effort in order to go do it. The other things may be a little more complex. Those things that take longer to go do, we might have to put them in a prioritization loop where my process improvement branch takes a look at them and says, while every idea is a potential good idea and may result in savings, it may not be based upon the available talent pool, procedure, parts, et cetera, that we have to go work on any given effort at any time. It may not be the thing that we put at the top of the list of what gives us the most bang for the buck in order to get the ships out on time. So we'll provide feedback to the individual that, hey, that was a really great idea, but as of right now, it's not making it to the top of the cut. I'll get to it, but it's important to have that dialogue with the employees so that they recognize that we didn't just put their idea at the bottom of the stack and we'll never get to it. So it's as much about building the culture of accepting people's ideas as it is putting the things in place to, in fact, work on them.
What was one of the ideas that one of your junior-most people gave you that you said, dang, that's a good idea?
So recently we won the NAVSEA Innovation Award, and that started with the mechanics on the deck plate in our inactivation reactor compartment disposal and recycling section, getting rid of the ships at the end of their service life. That's some pretty hard work. We cut up the submarines into smaller constituent parts in order to ultimately dispose of them, but a lot of hard work by some folks, sawzalls, that kind of stuff, cutting things up. Those folks really worked really hard on the cold cutting technology. A lot better environmentally from what we use as we work on the submarines, as well as a lot easier on the people. And those folks worked on a lot of different ways by which we could perform that effort. And ultimately, it was some great ideas that saved time, money, made it better on the people, and like I said, ultimately led to being recognized by the entire corporation as the way to do business.
You talked about disposal. Obviously, one of the things that is biggest things in disposal right now is the nation's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Enterprise. She's been she is in Newport News, where she is undergoing defueling and all of that stuff. You guys were supposed to be the disposal agent to scrap the ship. It looks like now it may stay on the East Coast. Bring us up to speed on that. And what are the potential implications on your shipyard? Because that is a very large ship with eight reactors, obviously,
right.
That needs to be processed and disposed of, which is a very, very big job. Talk to us a little bit about where we stand on Enterprise now.
Okay, Enterprise. Always in the plan was to be inactivated. In other words, pull the spent nuclear fuel out of the reactors by Huntington Ingalls Industries. So that was always the plan. That's where she is now, and that's what's ongoing. The plan that's in the piece of the plan that's in the discussions now is who ultimately does the rest of the work, the reactor compartment disposal piece, as well as the recycling of the remaining parts of the ship. Back to, again, what we're tasked with here, about 10% of the workload here for us is that inactivation, reactor compartment disposal, and recycling. The remainder of the workforce is supporting the active ships. As you look at balancing out the 13,500 folks that we have across what their priorities are on any one given day, it truly is supporting the fleet, and that's the active fleet. So as we look at balancing who the right person is to do the individual remaining parts after the inactivation of the AVAIL and HII, that could be anything from removing sections of the ship in order to right-size it, if you will, to potentially come here. It could ultimately be that all of it gets done in the private sector. The one thing I do know is, just like we discussed earlier with the balancing of the workload in the workforce, regardless of what decision the Navy makes is the right decision to go make, we'll ultimately rework that balance problem again in order to effectively utilize all the folks here focusing on whatever the priorities are that are ultimately established for us to execute.
When you talk about disposals, obviously, right-sizing the ship, just for our audience, Enterprise now is so large it can't transit the Panama Canal, so it's got to go all the way around down south and all the way back up. And so the question would be whether or not you're going to, basically cut the ship down to its contiguous reactor and engineering spaces, and then bring that through the Panama Canal and over here. When it comes to, folks may not also realize that we're bringing Virginia-class attack submarines online, which means Los Angeles-class attack submarines are being decommissioned. Is there a bit of a backlog on that work, or is that proceeding apace as ships come out of service, get scrapped, get recycled, and then ultimately disposed?
Yeah, so a backlog isn't the way I'd characterize it, as much as there's a large amount of that work that's headed our way. We currently have 3 Los Angeles-class submarines in the yard that are going through an activation. The removal of the spent fuel with the crews actually on board still. So the city of Corpus Christi, the Houston, and the Albuquerque are in the yard now in some phase of that work, as well as we have 2 ships in dock right now that are going through the preparation of the reactor compartments themselves to be ultimately disposed of in Hanford, as well as the recycling of the effort. We historically have had somewhere between 10 and 15 ships tied up at Mooring Alpha. That's those ships that are in some phase post-inactivation, post-removal of the fuel, awaiting the ultimate recycling effort and the reactor compartment disposal section. Right now we have 11 here, 10 Los Angeles-class submarines and 1 remaining cruiser. The Long Beach, what remains of the Long Beach is still here. That's probably likely what it's going to be. But again, we need to, as we step through the out years, balancing the priorities of the workload, look at how it is we step through those remaining ships to ensure that ultimately we efficiently walk through the remaining reactor compartment disposal and recycling effort.
And the last question is, on the overall backlog, how long is it going to take you to recover from the Budget Control Act imposed delays, manpower delays, and a couple of manpower shortages? How long is it going to take for you to catch up on all the work you've got to do? Because you just mentioned part of the same skills that are required on the repair side are also required on the disposal side because you're still looking at nuclear components and nuclear systems.
Right. Right now, through the entire FIDIP, the workload remains relatively steady at where it is right now. Each year, as we've stepped through, the tail end of the FIDIP has looked like it's dropped off to some extent. It looks like out through the mid-2020s, depending on what options we take to balance the workload and workforce problem, whether that be if we hire additional people, that may make it a little bit earlier in the 20s. If we don't, that workload would ultimately balance itself out with the available workforce that we've got now out into the mid-2020s. But that's about the time frame where things start to look like there might be a slight change in our workload as we shift from predominantly a focus on the fleet effort into the potential to increase that IRR workload in order to provide the workload that we need to sustain the current workforce.
Two last very quick questions. Question number one, on Virginia-class attack submarines, it's supposed to be a through-life core on it and not to be refueled. But
Right.
now those ships are being used so fast, there's going to be a trough. Is there any discussion that involves the shipyard about what may be done to refuel those ships, even though this was never in the plan to do so?
No.
You're enlisted. You've been an officer. You're submarine qualified. You're surface warfare qualified. You've spent time at virtually every one of the nation's shipyards. What are the keys to a successfully run shipyard and ship maintenance activity? What are the keys that you've learned over your long career?
Yeah, the people are always willing to and fully capable of executing whatever we task them to do. It's really that focus of, it goes back to, it's as simple as setting them up for success, getting them what they need to execute, building and maintaining the facilities they need to execute in, provide them the appropriate training and opportunity in order to develop, and then ultimately just as simple as balancing out the workload that they have in any given year to give them a fighting chance to work through it with the size of the workforce, within the reasonable set of capacity parameters to execute. In other words, a reasonable amount of overtime, a reasonable amount of contracting, a reasonable amount of travel they have to execute. It's that real basic problem that we have to, that it's my job to articulate what I need from the Navy in order to establish that. And honestly, it's the ongoing discussion that's going on right now, because it's recognized that truly is the what we need in order to succeed.
The other question, though, which just hopped into mind, is this. In World War II, you guys got very, very good at repairing ships very, very fast. And in the sort of anti-access area denial challenges, which I know the Navy's not supposed to use anymore because the CNO has said that word is off limits. But in those kind of challenges, are you guys thinking through the things that you would have to do to be able to, God forbid, if there is a scrap, to be able to get these big assets, skill sets you haven't relied on in 70 years, basically, to rapidly repair very big, very complex ships that are battle damaged to get them back into the fight?
Yeah, I think when you look at some of the things that we've done in the past, whether that be when a unfortunate collision, something has occurred over time where we've had a flex to go do some non-standard repair, if you will. The same skill sets that we developed to repair the ships today are the same ones that would be utilized to go do that. I'm very confident that the workforce would be able to flex to go support whatever effort they needed to in whatever action might occur or whatever we might change into. Just as we're preparing for the Ford and the Ohio replacement program and changing the skill sets in order to support that, we'd be able to rapidly change ourselves into whatever the Navy needed us to go execute.
Are those going to be lower maintenance ships or different maintenance ships?
I'd characterize it as different maintenance ships. It's like anything. The class maintenance plans will change. The things that we need to repair are different. The sequence of events will be different. The timing of them, the size of them will all be different. But it'll just be another thing within our workload that we need to go execute. And whether it's big, large, or indifferent, we'll figure it out.
Sir, thanks very much for spending so much time with us.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate your time.